So we have a wonderful night tonight with Koshin Paley Ellison, who's really one of the thought leaders in contemplative care in America today, and indeed internationally. I think he was just in Europe and just got back. And there's such an important area. How do we take care of our sick, of our dying, of our aged, of those in recovery, those who were addicted? And he's just serving such an important bodhisattva role in society. And I think, Koshin, I first heard about you on Facebook maybe 15 or 17 years ago. You had just started your New York Zen Center for Contemplative Care. I thought, that guy looks like a nice guy, and that's a pretty good story. So I think I sent you a small donation, and then that just, kept me seeing you over the years. And then we heard much of you from our mutual friend, Marie Howe, the poet. We were just talking about how Marie Howe won the Pulitzer Prize recently for poetry and how proud of her we all are. And also Susan Pollock has been a great follower of yours and student of yours for the last 6 years. So we have lots of connections here. I'd like to open up, if I may, Koshin, with a poem by Marie Howe. We have read it 2 or 3 times, really, even over the last couple of weeks, and I really love this poem. And so, please, if you could share it with us. Also, I did want to say I don't believe John Terrence on the call and Allison Atwell is on the call. As you know, John has not been well, and we're sending him all our love. And I ask that you do same for his rapid recovery. So he is in our hearts and minds tonight. Thank you all. So Koshin, please.
Well, first of all, it's so nice to see you, John, and so nice to see you all. And so nice to take a moment to see all your faces, butterflies and all. So cool. So just very happy to celebrate our friend Marie, and as we call her now, the Lady Pulitzer, and her Lady Pulitzership. And so it was really sweet to celebrate when people who just are so dedicated receive things that they don't expect. Mm. And so this poem, The Gate, is from a amazing book of poems that actually someone handed me when I was in Spain, maybe a long time ago. And someone said, you have to read this book. And I read this book, What the Living Do. And there's in the back of it is this picture of Marie, but you can't really see her face. And I was like, well, this mysterious lady, I want to find out where she is. And whoever she is, I want to study with her. So I found out she was at this place called Sarah Lawrence College and taught in an MFA. So I just thought, oh, I guess I'll get an MFA. So first day of school, she said, oh, do you want to ride back to the city? I said, sure. And Sarah Lawrence is just north of New York City. We got in her car and she said, I have a question for you. Would you rather be a baby or a soldier who has to kill the baby? And I said, I was done, and I couldn't actually respond. And she said, let's just go, and there's actually in a poem of hers that comes out later. Anyway, it was one of the reasons why that I've always loved Marie, that she is willing to ask difficult questions. And actually that question itself feels really relevant to this time that we're in as Zen Buddhists, or people who are interested in Zen Buddhism, like how do we hold the tension of the opposite? It feels so relevant and beautiful. So, this is a poem from What the Living Do, and about her brother Johnny who died. A gate. I had no idea that the gate I would step through to finally enter the world would be the space my brother's body made. He was a little taller than me, a young man, but grown himself by then. Done at 28, having folded every sheet, rinsed every glass he would ever rinse under the cold and running water. This is what you've been waiting for, he used to say. And I'd say, what? And he'd say, this, holding up my cheese and mustard sandwich. And I'd say, what? And he'd say, this, sort of looking around.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I hope we touch on a couple of your stories of your own life that very much express this, right? And so if I may, I'd love to jump into, I don't know, your early life. I think you were 7 or 8 when you decided you want to become a Zen monk or something.
So I grew up in a very chaotic environment, and which is very common for people. And I grew up in the second generation of people from the Holocaust, and so a lot of those families were quite chaotic, and mine was like that, and filled actually with people with beautiful values and super challenging. Often their values and what they did not match. So there was a big gap between that, and I felt a little bit, as the youngest of 3, a little bit lost. And I had this wonderful grandfather who was my godparent, and he lived in this place called Newport Beach, which felt very exciting to me. So like I would get on a plane from New York and go to Newport Beach, which probably some of you know is in Southern California, and just outside of LA. And he had this apartment, and we would lay on the white shag carpet, and he would collect National Geographic magazines, and we would look, like lay in our bellies and like just thumb through. And at that time there were like lost native tribes, like the lost native tribe of this place, lost native tribe of that place, and every once in a while they would have like a profile of a city, which felt like, ooh, a city. And one time when I was 8 years old, there was a profile of Tokyo. And I still remember flipping the page and the smell of, remember like the smell of, remember magazine? And the smell of it, and turning the page, and there was just this beautiful picture of this monk in what's called an aragasa hat, which is those big bamboo hats where you can't really see their eyes, but you see a little smile. And all the people around him were blurred. And I remember reading the captions of Zen Buddhist monk in Tokyo or something. And I just remember Zen Buddhist monk. I want to be that when I grow up. And it's so amazing, to like think about that, because, I did. I mean, apparently the chances of that are very high. So, but it was really amazing to see an image as a child of what's possible. It felt like, I think there was something about it being a little bit alien from another culture and another place. It gave me like this telos, this what was possible, which is so amazing. Like we all get glimpses of things maybe in our lives, and we can move towards it. Really beautiful.
Yeah. That is beautiful. And that also brings up the question of karma and deep, deep connections, multi-generational connections. And we've recently talked about the multi-generational trauma of humans, including Jews who suffered under the Holocaust and their families, generation of generation. And when will it end? As you say, don't, this house of pain, you quote Buddha Siddhartha, house of pain must end. So you also at some point realized that you were gay, and I think you moved with your family to upstate New York. Is that right? And you just, it just became kind of a real shit show for you up there. I mean, not only because you were Jewish, but you were, feeling gay, and maybe you weren't a big guy, and I don't know.
Yeah, it was complex. So my father was one of these. He was from Brooklyn. My parents were from Brooklyn, and then he on the War on Poverty in the '60s. He was one of these. He just out of law school, and they were looking for lawyers, 50 lawyers, to be in the War on Poverty to advocate for poor people, and he was, aligned to that. So he was like also applied, and they sent him to the land what was called Syracuse, which is upstate New York, and it's a small city, and about like 250,000 people. And he worked there. But then after my parents got divorced, my mother had this idea of living off the land, and she was kind of hippie-oriented person, and thought like, we'll grow our own food, and it's going to be great. We're going to live in the mountains, but she didn't really think about it too clearly. And we moved to this like very tiny town called Salisbury Center. The population literally was 110. And when we moved there, they changed the sign to 114. And they, the first night we were there, they painted Jews on the mailbox and circled the house at night with four-wheelers and shot with shotguns, shot up the house. And that was our welcoming of that time. It was actually incredibly nightmarish and painful and terrifying, actually, and in ways that like I write about in Untangled a little bit more specifically, like actually being hunted in the woods and being chased, and so that was, and I never really understood, like, to me, being Jewish just meant like, potato pancakes and holidays, and didn't really have to do with I didn't have any sense of your body being that. It just felt like something we did, not who we were. And suddenly I felt like it was who I was. And that was really poignant. And then I moved back with my father back into the big city of Syracuse, and went to a very mostly affluent public school. It was affluent because of the geographics. It was like mostly professors and kids. And there, like, being a young gay kid was not so fun. And of course, like, the school bully was literally at my bus stop. It was me and him. It was so awful. I know. So that's, an early introduction to the fire of life, right? Into the challenge of what does it mean to suffer.
And you kind of had a guardian angel or a guardian bodhisattva in I think your karate teacher, Mr. White. And he taught you some pretty important lessons, including how to fight back, I guess.
Yeah. So yeah. So I saw this movie called Star Wars, which is like the first Star Wars, which was like a long time ago. And I remember feeling very drawn to the character of Luke Skywalker, because he was this kind of person who didn't really belong to his family and felt very whiny and difficult. And I related to that. And And as I often say, like I actually couldn't figure out how do you get to that place, like how to get to Tatooine or Dagobah, like how do like maybe Janine Lentine knows, but I didn't know. And uh, so a couple of years later, this movie, The Karate Kid, came out, and I'd be like, "Oh, karate could." But it was also the idea of these characters, of these really important characters for me, which was Mr. Miyagi from The Karate Kid and Obi-Wan Kenobi. Like the thought that, like, my good, there can be a teacher, but not like school teacher, like someone who can actually really mentor you and really help you learn what does it mean to be a person and have an integrity about who you are. And that was so inspiring to me. And I thought, oh, a karate school, I know how to do. So like there was the local strip mall, and underneath, this is the ironic thing. So underneath the drugstore, there was this really swampy Dagobah kind of place, which was the karate school, that smelled so bad, like mildew, and it felt kind of swampy, and they'd like literally banged down some wood floors on top of it all. And the teacher Sensei White turned out to be this incredible human being. And before he was a Zen person, this is when I was 11, and he used to have us sit in seiza, which is up on your knees, and learning how to he would circle us as we were sitting there. It was so painful just sitting on that hardwood floor on your knees for 15, 20 minutes, sweating, a lot of sweating. And he would say that you'll never be free until you're still with your pain. And he would just repeat that over and over again. And for me, that was, as someone who had experienced so much violence and feeling victimized by the violence, which was also true. I was the victim of the violence, but I was starting to build an identity, even as a young person, as a victim of violence, which also I experienced other forms of violence too in my home, sexual violence and physical violence at home. So like it just felt like I was learning, like, what does that mean to actually, it felt like I'd got tastes of freedom.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
That's great. And then you actually did defend yourself against this bully, but you gave up Mr. White and all of karate because you were so, I guess you were so abhorred by your own ability to hurt others.
It was the first time that so the bully was at my bus stop, and every day he would shove me into the gravel, and every day I knew that actually I could take him out, but I would let him do it anyway because Sensei White was saying, never ever use this for attacking, never use it. And I guess I took it very literally. So like for several years, I was being beat up every day, but I would allow it. But I knew how to fall and knew how to actually kind of make it not too bad. But then one day I just said, that's enough already. And I really hurt him. And I did defend myself. And I was so kind of ashamed because I felt like I had betrayed my teacher. And I never could go back. I just like disappeared. Mm-hmm. But the weirdest thing was like the social benefit. Like suddenly, like I was like that little kid in your high school where like all the people were like, who's that little weird kid? And suddenly, because I beat up the bully, the school bully, I was like cool suddenly. And that was actually so disturbing to me too. So it's like I lost my teacher, and then I felt like this like very disturbing benefit, which was like I was cool because I was violent and actually beat up the school bully. Yeah.
And somehow things didn't get better for you. They got worse, and you talk about it in Untangled. By the way, folks, I'm sure you know this book. It's just a wonderful book of stories and lessons. But you contemplated suicide one time, and your recollection of that was so searing to me. Could you talk about that a little bit and what pulled you out?
There was so much violence in our house, and my siblings, were also perpetrators of violence, and so like there was no safety, and so I felt completely alone. And this is actually right before I went to this is related to the karate school. So like that, I was so desperate to have a way out that 11 years old, I found myself in their upstairs bathroom, the door locked, and I was pretty sure like this was it for me. And just to think about an 11-year-old kid. These razors that I'd found, a pack of new razors. And I remember just actually like holding them, and I knew that you don't do it across, you do it down. And like, how did I know that? And I don't know, just like even like right now, like just thinking about this and bring this towards that boy, towards 11-year-old children, myself as an 11-year-old child, and I began to make an incision. And somehow, like in the back of our house were these giant pine trees. And there's, that amazingness of like with pine trees in the sky. And there's just like that moment where the sky pops. It's like like the sun's setting, and then suddenly it turns that deep, headstrong blue. That color. It's just so specific.
Deep indigo. Yeah.
And somehow I just like was literally cutting my wrist, and I was so caught by the color. And I was so moved by the color. And the trees moving in the color. And I knew I wanted to live. And that I knew that I had to change something. So it was like very later on when I was 17, I'm learning that incredible Rilke poem, Archaic Torso of Apollo, where at the end, like he's talking about this torso, just looking at this torso, and just like that it's suffused with light inside. And it's just like that he realizes that he has to change his life. I knew in that moment, from that color and the movement of trees, like just experiencing that I needed not only to live, but to change. And that's actually what inspired me to go to karate school the next day.
Yeah. Wow. God, that's amazing. And then somehow you got into Zen at 17. One thing I did want to say is, I see these things, in your writings, and it kind of becomes your personal expression of your life and of the Dharma. And one thing that you said that really touched me, sort of in relation to this, is that in my life, I struggled with the narrative that I am a victim. And a story that I heard my family talking about the Holocaust, and your uncle reiterating that. And you somehow learned to not be a victim, which is such an important lesson.
Yeah, yeah. It was actually through my uncle Victor, who the book is dedicated to. It was this amazing, and Victor Honigman, and he was a man who lived with us when I was a kid, and had survived the Holocaust, and and one of the things that he learned while he was in the camps was that about beauty, and that I remember him describing. I was just with a cousin in Holland who also, we both loved Victor, and we both remember the story that he would tell. Like, he would lean down in the mud outside the barrack, and there was this little tiny tip of a blade of grass coming out from in the mud, and it was cold. And he knelt down inside of the mud and just was amazed by the color green. And it was so fresh, he said, and just so beautiful. Like, that he said that, in order to really live, we have to be immersed by beauty and allow ourselves in the midst of the terror to see the beauty. And he was an artist and an amazing human being. And so learning from him, it was all kind of during this time where it was actually right after I beat up the bully. Like, my uncle Victor moved in with us. And so it's kind of such amazing timing to like have a new amazing human being, a mentor who could say, like, you can live through, you can endure. Like, he endured watching his entire family being burned alive in their barn, and he was able to see beauty in the world. And he was an amazing, loving person. And I remember thinking, wow, if he can do that, I can learn how to do and how to love, that things are possible. So it's, again, almost like this telos, like that all of these moments in my life that, wow, it's so moving, like to think about like these moments where like these North Stars come out and you're like, oh, that could be possible. Wow.
Yeah, when you're describing Uncle Victor's experience, it kind of made me think again to you looking out to the trees and to the deep blue sky and that beauty just in the midst of pain and going towards the beauty,
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Amazing.
So you became a Zen student at 17, which actually was the time that I started studying Zen, hitchhiking down to sessions at the Zen Center of Los Angeles with my Zumi Roshi. And my father would not give me the $21 for the airplane flight with PSA, but he'd drop me off on the on-ramp and he'd say, I know you want to go meditate with your Zumi Roshi, so I'll help you out a bit.
Oh, good.
But tell us about how you got into meditating and this way.
Yeah. So with Sensei White, I did start sitting every day, doing zazen at 11. But that actually continued, and so I continued to practice zazen every day. I didn't really know what I was doing, not really, but I was really into it. But I was reading, like Paul Reps, and like I was reading anything I could get my hands on, and even like Shogun and like anything like Japanesey, like I was just so into it. And then, I was a late bloomer like you. So at 17, I hitchhiked out, interesting, because I learned that Allen Ginsberg was alive and was actually founded some Buddhist college out in Boulder, Colorado. And I was like, cool, that's some cool shit. And so I said, I'm going to go out there. So I hitchhiked out to Boulder at 17. And on my first day there, I got out of the car that actually in front of Arapahoe Avenue, where the Boulder campus was, and of Naropa, which was called Naropa Institute at the time. And down the street was this guy who was a Italian-looking guy, and in robes, which I hadn't seen that before, like a kind of a Western-looking person in Japanese robes. And he was coming down the street, smoking a cigarette, looking so cool. And I was like, all right, oh. And it was this man named John Dido Laurie. And he was one of the successors of Maizumi Roshi, and was just like, in my mind, like cool as shit, just like really cool. And I said, like, I want to learn the Zen way. He's like, all right, well, do you know how to sit zazen? And so I started actually hanging out with him that summer. And then he was like, well, come to, at that time, that wasn't the monastery yet. Zen Mountain Monastery. It was just like this like art institute kind of thing. And which was basically a monastery, but with under the guise of an art institute. And yes, I started practicing with John Dido Laurie and that community for several years. It was really amazing. But I think that Dido didn't really know what to do with me. I was so young. And at that time, there were not that many like people like 17 years old, like at the monastery. But yeah. And so it goes. I was a late bloomer, like you.
Yeah. I remember when Dido was out there and just opening up that art institute.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of a personal question. Maizumi Roshi, obviously, in the mid 1980s, it was revealed that there was a lot of bad behavior going on. There was some substance abuse. There was some abuse of, responsible relationship with students. But you wrote very compassionately about his response to that. And I know I was in Japan at the time. I was studying with Yamada Koun, where I lived for 8 years, actually. And so I was no longer involved in ZCLA, but I know that it really blew it up. And Maizumi, it's hard for me to express how sort of important he was to me in my early years. But you wrote very touchingly about his reconciliation. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, he was having sex with students and drinking and, like doing the kind of almost cliche things that people in business and not just in spiritual communities, families, like all the places where people in power relationships do. And as far as I know, which, I only know a little bit, I don't know another example of someone who was called out on all of that stuff who didn't defend himself. Didn't say like, oh no, it didn't happen, or it wasn't that bad, or I meant something else. He just said, there's nothing I can say. I caused harm and I'm responsible for it. As someone who grew up talk about Holocaust background, and then in my own family and communities where there was so much abuse and no one was taking responsibility. the people who committed sexual abuse with me, the people who are, were physically abusive, the bullies, like no one. I never even, and then later on, of course, hearing about how so many spiritual groups and business people, and then even in the Me Too movement, and like how many people say, I caused harm and there's nothing to defend. I just was like blown away. And I had met him shortly after this. So what he would do is sit in the zendo after he just kept practicing. First of all, mind blowing. The whole place blew up, of course, but it's I just love that he stayed, had the integrity to stay, and would just allow people after morning practice to scream at him, yell at him, cry with him, whatever. And he just did this for such a long time. And he never, again, defended or pretended that he didn't do it or anything. He would just receive. And during this time, I had met him. And I found him, it was the first time I had met him, and I found like there was this deep sweetness there. Like he had been through a fire that few people are courageous enough to walk through. And so I've always thought, I remember the first time that I met him, that I was like, I want to be that courageous one day. To just be like, I'm responsible and not have to defend anything. Like just to be responsible for what we do, and we're not going to ever do it perfectly. And it's so interesting because, many years later, at our center, about 10 years ago, I'm friends with one of his daughters named Mimi, who is also my grandmother's name, and Mimi Maizumi. And she came and she said, oh, I, would love to, my father would be so touched by your practice here. And, I would love to make an offering here. And so she painted this beautiful portrait of Maizumi Roshi that we have in my Doga Center. And so I always appreciate, be able to practice alongside Maizumi Roshi. And also our center is in the Maizumi Roshi line. So we go from Maizumi to Bernie to Peter Matheson to our teacher, Diane Friedman. And so it's like a very sweet connection.
Yeah, that's lovely. I felt as an observer that the white flame Asanga had a tremendous burden of shame, which I felt was in some ways dampening the great light that Maizumi had left. Do you feel like that burden is somehow lifting, that light is showing more?
Look, most schools and lines have problems, and I feel very, I think that when we try to make it and pretend that it's not that, then it gets really weird. But that's why I've always been very open about what Maizumi Roshi did. Like, just saying like it's sexual students, he was an alcoholic. And those are, to me, the fact that he did those things and continued practicing is what's most important. And that he was a deeply flawed human being, but he was a human being. And I feel like that it does not make it okay what he did, right? His actions were not okay. But I think that many communities try to feel like, oh, no, it's a terrible, but we shouldn't talk about it. we shouldn't ever talk about it. But to me, that's why it's so interesting, because I received Dharma transmission about 12 years ago or something, and but I started working with a new teacher recently, and the last 4 or 5 years, and a Japanese teacher, and he always talks about that at least half of our practice must be atonement. And I feel like that is it's always been true for me. Like, we're just, not that smart. I'm not that smart, but I'm willing. And like I always tell my students, we actually have a Tangaryo, which is we have a ceremony where people sit all day and practice. I always tell students that, I will disappoint and fail you for sure in some way. And yet I'll be willing to be in the mix with you. And so I feel like atonement is so helpful and realistic, because I will fail. I'm a human being. I'm glad to be a human being. I don't want to be a saint. I don't want to be a guru. I don't want to be, sometimes, I don't know if even being a teacher is that helpful. I want to be a human being and suffer alongside and vow with you.
That's lovely. I love that. The good enough teacher, right? Winnicott's a good enough mother. Yeah. I was listening to your talk with Susan and Chodo. By the way, you say that Chodo is handsome in the book, and I agree. I think Chodo's pretty handsome, but you mentioned a statistic. I think it was like 30 or 40% of all medical people are thinking of leaving the business. And, I was thinking about the good enough teacher, but nobody wants a good enough doctor, and you can't be a perfect doctor. And I wonder if that puts so much pressure on the caregivers in our society, including those of contemplative care.
Yeah, it's so interesting. We have this amazing, I sometimes can't believe that we get to do what we get to do, but like we teach in Japan and to physicians and clinicians there, and in different medical schools in the United States, and also in Europe, in Ireland and England and Amsterdam, in Netherlands, and the same problems everywhere. That's the most interesting. And we started worrying about doctors about 20 years ago, that were feeling like they were in trouble because they were always talking about they weren't good at that time. Everyone was talking about self-care. They're really bad at their self-care. They're really bad at their self-care. And, because we're monks or something, that they're like, oh, we have to confess to you. We get a lot of confession. And then, of course, that it changed recently in the last 5-6 years, that everyone's telling us how bad they are at their self-compassion, because that became the new thing, right? Self-compassion. And now everyone says, oh, I'm really bad at my wellness. And so that's the newer word, because now most places have their chief wellness officer. But the reality is, at least in my experience, is that people are suffering. The reality is that 35 to 40% of physicians said that they're going to leave the profession in the next 3 to 5 years. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of doctors in a short amount of time. And so that's spooky.
Yeah.
And I think that's also happening because they are not taught how to deal with their own experiences. They're not even taught how to look at people. They're not taught how to have challenging conversations. They're not taught how to really be human beings. most of them are taught, maybe they'll have a good elective, but they're not often taught the skills that they actually need. And so we have been passionate, as a Buddhist. I think really passionate about and feeling very moved to help physicians and clinicians about really how to address their intrapersonal life. So really we have this great curriculum for both lay caregivers and nurses and social workers, and it's called Foundations in Contemplative Care that we've been doing for 19 years, as well as now we have a medical fellowship for doctors and nurse practitioners, because those folks felt like they really needed their own group and to really suffer together and learn together. And that's really powerful. But really all of those programs are really about like, how do we get really clear, both with Buddhist precepts and the Eightfold Path and the Four Noble Truths, like how do we ground ourselves inside of ourselves? And how do we build really good relationships, interpersonal relationships with like our family members, loved ones, neighbors, baristas? Like we get like super granular, and it's so important. And then we talk about clinical work, but like I feel like that most people are talking about things so segmented, and I think that we often think about ourselves in such weird segmented ways that are not so helpful. And in the realm of the Buddha Dharma, that's what's so beautiful about it, right? But like, isn't that why we're all here? It's like there's a wholeheartedness that we're interested in, but like I never figured out like how do you practice wholeheartedness? What does that look like? Right? And like sometimes we're just in the Zendo, but like what does that look like when we're looking in the mirror in the morning? What does that look like when we are feeling lonely? And what do we do about that? So I feel like what I love about this contemplative care and contemplative medicine that we do is like that we're really thinking about, yes, you need to practice. So important. Study Dogen. And right, Susan? Yeah, let's do it. And but I think it's also really important, like how do we learn together how to be loving with ourselves and others equally?
You have a beautiful anecdote in Untangled about, and we actually wrote a note and we talked about it on our Monday night regular weekly zazen, and you were with that old man and he was whispering something. Could you tell that story to us?
It's like a crazy story. So yeah, I feel like in many ways this story encapsulates what we, I think, all need in some way. At least I do. Maybe you too. But like I was called to the emergency room late at night. It was probably like 3 a.m. I get to the emergency room and they tell me which bed to go to, and I get there and standing against almost like the wall, but it's just, one of those pull curtains. I'm sure we're all aware of what those are like, for privacy when there's no privacy. And but these 4 women are standing against the curtain like this, like as if it's a wall, like as far away as possible from the person in the bed. And I said, I, introduced myself and what's happening, and they're like, we don't know, and they just point to the bed, and there's this little man curled up almost like a little fern, almost like in a fetal position in the bed. And I said, who is it? And one said, it's my husband. The other three were like, it's our father. I said, do you know what's happening? He said, no. And I said, okay. And so I went over and I put my hand on his shoulder, and just like he was whispering something over and over. And I just put my ear right by his mouth, and he was saying, "Oh, oh." And back to his family said he wants someone to hold him. They're like, you do that. We don't do that. I said, well, I'll make you a deal. I'll hold him if you hold me. So just like make a little chain. And so I went and held him just very, very gently. And he kept saying more. And I actually ended up getting into bed with this man in the emergency room because he kept saying more and more and more. And the wife and the daughters then came and were holding me, putting their hands on my back as I spooned their father as he died. And it was probably one of the most intense because he died saying more, more. But it was so, and just like what we need to be held. I mean, it's like I feel so inspired still to this day by that man. And one of his daughters writes me a card every year. And she's like, I'll just never forget. Because I learned that we were not those kinds of people who do that. But it is not who actually I need to be. But I never knew that. Like we don't learn. Like that's why I love what we do. Because like we're helping all of us remember what we actually need, I think. You know, it's just my opinion, but it's because also what's so interesting is that we think about statistics. The last year, there was that study about 35% of people described not having a single friend, which is about the same amount of people who are leaving medicine. But that included people who are married. So sometimes we can feel even more alone because we're in a relationship, but no one's holding us, right? It's just very moving, I think. Like we can learn how to do amazing things. Like that man and that family taught me an amazing thing. Like we can also say like we don't do that, but they also did want me to do it. There was some impulse that they also knew it needed to happen. Like, oh, how do we help each other do what we feel like would be actually healing, would actually be helpful, would actually be loving even.
Yeah. You know what really amazes me, Koshin, is how you bring your clinical care practice into your Zen practice, and we talk about walls and barriers and curtains, and those curtains kind of go away because when you were very early in your clinical experience, I guess, when this took place, but you realized that you needed a mind of not knowing to be able to react openly. and spontaneously and courageously and lovingly. You needed all of that. You needed not knowing. And that's such an important part of our teaching, for sure.
So important, because the reality is, like, I don't think any of us know that much. We know like this much. Like, if you think about the earth, it's so huge, and we don't even know like really what's going on with the earth, right? And never mind like who here knows a lot about what's going on Mars. We don't know anything. And like, never mind the next galaxy. Like, we don't know anything. It's so joyful. And to me, the more I can remember that, I think it was Kosho Uchiyama Roshi who says something like, to release the small self is to allow ourselves to be inside of the expanding universe. I mean, let's go. Who's ready? It's so wonderful. Like, that is like, what a wonderful way to practice, right? Like, we tend to think too much about like, man, this little shape, me. But like, so much more is interesting and possible.
Yeah. That's great. Well, I'd like to ask people if they have chat questions to please put them in. And maybe Susan, you're so good at this, helped us out last time. Perhaps you could help us read some chat questions if you have any. One thing, Koshin, that I read about you and as a teacher, I find very helpful for me is this cultivation of curiosity. I'm curious about what's going on in your mind. I'm curious about how everything came, to you. I'm curious about everything. And in a sense, that curiosity is a kind of a not knowing, right? I don't know you this moment. So teach me, tell me, and it's really kind of a wonderful thing. Some of those points that you make about that.
It's so cool, isn't it? Like, to realize that. I mean, to me, this lately, I'm really into the word, awesome. Just like to be filled with awe, and to me, to be filled with awe and wonder is to be curious. It is to see the little tip of blade of grass in the midst of mud and a concentration camp. Like that, I feel like that those glimmers are like leading us through a beautiful path. And I feel so grateful for those glimmers that, Shakyamuni Buddha and Prajnatara and Bodhidharma and Wakey, like all of these, Emerging and Dogen, like all of these amazing iron grindstone Lu, like all of these freaking amazing teachers who just, are leaving these glimmers of their lives and these shards of their wholeheartedness. And all we have to do is listen and be a little bit dumber. Like, for me, like, that's also like the kind of releasing of the small self is not known, right? Like, to like Uchiyama is saying, like, and to me, like, to actually give ourselves to lineage and allow ourselves to, I love allowing, to almost like lay back in the river of lineage that is actually flowing from Shakyamuni Buddha and before, and it will go way beyond any of us. And that if we rest in that, I find myself so much more helpful, because I don't feel like I have so many good ideas. I just feel like I'm a decent listener, and I'm so curious and filled with wonder.
Yeah, yeah. That's wonderful. Susan, do we have any questions?
Yes, and we have some wonderful questions from your fans. So let me start with Liv's question first. Deeply appreciating the threads of fairy tales and magical realism in Untangled, might you say more about fiction or the elsewhere as a conduit for accessing the present?
Mm. Wow. When I was 17, so I came back from Naropa. I went to this place called New York City. And then in New York City was this thing called this like men's gathering thing. And I was like, what's that about? And so when I went to this thing, there was Robert Bly and this man named James Hillman and this guy Michael Mead on the stage. And I was like, wow, look at who are these people? And they were like telling stories and beating drums. It was like Red Iron John had come out, like that, this book, and which actually is a very interesting book. And weaving together the mythopoetic reality of life. But they were teaching fairy tales and singing and who knows what. I don't even remember. But what I remember is that life was a tapestry and that we can weave it. And they were telling a lot of Zen stories and how. And Jim Hillman became a mentor of mine at that time. Because I don't know, because I was like also like again, like young kid, you know, and he was like, wow, look at this like kid. And most of the guys there were like middle-aged folks. Anyway, and so learning about Jungian psychology was the beginning of my Jungian path. And he mentored me up until when he died, you know, wow, was that 7 years ago, something new. And the funny thing about Jim is that he used to make fun of me all the time because I was like very Buddhist. And he was always like, that's dumb. To be kind of, because he thought I was like religious or something. And, but it was so interesting. Like right before he died, we went up, spent time with him and he was like, you know, I thought I wasn't afraid. And I think there's something to that whole Zen thing. Yeah, but he really taught me the love of images and really just allowing images to work on you, and that the images themselves are like, that's why images of like bodhisattvas and Zen gardens and even rakasus, right? Like our rakasus and like all the things are like, these are images that actually do something to us. Like John Joseph has got like a rock and rakasu, like it's doing something to us, right? And like this image, like, my God, it's gorgeous. You know, like it evokes things. And Hansel and Gretel and all the things, those are things that actually act on us, or as the beautiful Dogen teaching where it says, you know, that allowing the 10,000 things to flow through you. And it's just like, to me, that's part of the mythopoetic reality of our ancestors, of fairy tales, of Zen stories, of all of it, just like, delish. And like, how do you just allow it to change you? So beautiful. To me, it makes life.
So
It feels like everything alive.
thanks, Liv, for a wonderful question. Let me combine these two, Janine and Elizabeth, if this is a good time, because there are two questions. Could you say a bit about the roots of goodness as you're about to begin the commit to sit, i.e., that's Dogen's
Mm,
final writing? Anything about that? And then follow up, i.e., what is it about that text that resonates with you? And if I could
mm.
just very quickly say, if people don't know about Commit to Sit, it is a remarkable program. Koshin does it twice a year, and I feel it's life-saving.
So commit to sit is our practice periods, and we have a crew of Zen teachers from Japan, from the United States, and we just study a text together. And I give a video teaching every day, each morning, and we're going to be studying the roots of goodness, which is this new, I guess, a new translation by Thomas Wright, I believe, of this incredible teaching from Shakyamuni Buddha and Dogen on the 8 awarenesses of awakened people. But it's the commentary, which is like, like by Uchiyama Roshi, and he's such a tiger and such a kind and ferocious person. And what inspires me about the text is that it's all about growing up. Uchiyama wants us to stop whining and grow up and be an adult. And he actually feels that that's actually what our practice is about. So you could even say it's like a stop whining is like a toning. It's like stop waiting for the big babysitter to save us. And we can do it. Like Jimmy's moth or butterfly, right? Like we can do it. Yeah. So I feel like in many ways it's just it's really cool just to say like sometimes we need to like a release valve and like complain a little bit, but then like enough. And like let's see some beauty. Let's do some amazing things. Which is just like paying attention. Like today, I saw this like huge mass of hydrangeas. I just like had to stick my face in that. Just like, like that's what I'm talking about. Like doing things that just inspire you and delight you. Could be worse,
So, another thing that's delightful here is your partner, a Zen practitioner as well. And if so, is it as meaningful to him as it is to you?
I could never speak for him, nor would I. He is definitely a Zen practitioner, and he is a Zen teacher and a Zen monk, and just a marvelous human. And his expression is very different from mine, which is so cool. And like, as each of ours are. And to me, like, that's what makes life interesting. And it is a deep joy. We founded the Zen Center together because my grandmother said that he and I should do that. When you hear a Hungarian little lady about to die and she's like, there's something to the Zen thing. She's like, I never thought I'd say it, but it's true. And you should teach people how to bring the care. She's like, so many people are well-meaning, but well-meaning is not good enough. She's like, people have to learn how to behave with care and so she was the one who got us going.
Well, continuing on care and love, Amy asks, were not those kinds of people really touched me? Being part of a family where you love people so much and there's so much pain, patterns of hurt, resentment, etc. I sometimes feel like the dying man in the bed saying, hold me more, more. Any ideas for how to work with this?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Lineage is very, at least in my experience, very healing. if you really allow yourself to belong in a wider sense of this tradition. Something very cool is practicing with lots of different communities. So like one of the things I love to do when I travel is like go and sit with other places. And then you start to realize like, oh my God, like we're like, it's not just our little group. Like this group is so cool, but like there are like little groups like this or big group, whatever it is, a lot of places. And like for me, there's a sense of belonging and then the opportunity to build relationships and learning how to be a friend. What I always encourage people to do, since my grandmother died 22 years ago, which is amazing amount of time and not a lot of time, I really realized when she died that I needed, because I loved her so much and I never had felt love like that, that I needed to have different kinds of friends. And she's like, my grandmother, she's so funny. She's like, she put Chodo, who's my husband, in charge of me. She's like, you know, his parents, very well meaning, but you know, not everyone has the capacity. And so that was very helpful to hear, actually, you know, and to stop trying to get something from people who are like that's just not their thing. And not good or bad, you know, it's just not their thing. And I realized like, I want to build relationships, nourish relationships where I feel held, where I feel like I could call that person no matter when and be like, or whatever, or like something amazing, whatever it is. You know, I want to have like a little circle, it doesn't have to be big, of like people who are like, I see you. And to me, that is the most worthwhile thing. And I've really found that through Sangha, through practicing with Sanghas. Sangha practice, you know, Shakyamuni, that famous teaching, you know, always, you know, I feel like it's said a lot in Buddhist circles, but I don't know if we practice it. You know, that he says, you know, Ananda says to him, like, how much of the spiritual life is good spiritual friends? Is it half? And the Buddha's like, no, the whole deal. Because I feel like actually learning how to love and have real loving friendships is the deal. Or as Shinra Suzuki said, you know, like the whole practice is about loving everybody, but we have to keep practicing because some people are very challenging to love. But it is still our responsibility to learn how to love them, which is cool. So it's still not like blaming them, like, yeah, they're difficult to love. I'm like, no, I have to figure out how to reach you. My practice is to learn how to love each of you. Like, look at all of you. Right?
Well, continuing this theme of relationships, we have another question. When you say let's go, toward what might be termed a laboratory of relationality, are you developing with others something like the practice of discovery that informs both heart and mind so that subsequent generations have some strands of hope?
I don't know. I'm doing what I can. And we all can do a little bit. Like even like Chodo and I we love to go to certain places because like the people are great. Like our local Starbucks has like these amazing people in it. They're like the coolest, funkiest kids from Fashion Institute of Technology, like college up the street. Cool. They're so cool. And like we love each of them. And I don't know. And they like we walk in, they're like, and they're like, what's up? You know, like we have so much fun, you know, and learning how to have those kinds of relationships to me is a teaching. And like to me, like that's also what we can do. Like I know a whole bunch of things about each of those people and I miss them. We were in Europe for 2 weeks and I was like, wow, we get to see like, Fabian and all those folks like when we get back. And when we got back, they're like, "Oh my God, Koshin, how was the trip?" Like there's this to me like that. It can be very simple, like getting to know the people at a local coffee place. Like I feel like that's how we changed things. Like I feel like that sometimes we're like the other day, like our diversity group was like, "We should take on authoritarian governments." I'm like, I don't know how to do that. But I know actually maybe how to bring kindness into our neighborhood. What if we all like brought more kindness into our neighborhoods where people felt like people gave a shit? And actually, it also is fun. Like I have a friend who he did our foundations course and he's actually famously skeptic. And I was like, I double dog dare you to, start getting to know your local people. And he what he discovered is like, wow, it actually feels really good to build those kind of relationships. I was like, grocery store, baristas, wherever that is. Like get to know the checkout people, get to know their names. I feel like that's the revolution, looking at people in the eye. I see you. I see you, Sean McConnell, Susan Williams, Waldo. Like, yeah, I see you. Brandon Millen, Andy. Like just like really like looking at people. I'm like, oh, you're a human being.
If I may jump in with a slightly lively, controversial question. You said something a few weeks ago.
I want you to do that, Susan.
Well, you're used to it. You said something that fascinated me about Kensho, which is like, don't get caught up in it. And so much of the tradition is focused on Kensho. And we recently had Henry Schuckman, and his first book was so much about Kensho. So I'd love to hear you say more.
Love Henry. Yeah, to me, it's not very important. Like, I think it's overrated. And I think that most of us seek immersive things all the time or occasionally. And that if we follow those kind of insights, like actually one of my students said the coolest thing to me today. I was so just like, say it again. And she was like, oh, I was out with my 3 sisters and I realized something that like I feel totally much more in my practice and with the precepts when I'm with one of my sisters alone. But when I'm with all the sisters together, it goes out the window. And she's like, isn't that interesting? And I said, that is interesting. And she's like, I think I'm going to really be exploring that. And I'm like, that is so cool. And to me, that is so much more important than like, oh, I'm at one with all things. And then you go and act like a jerk, like I feel like that those integrative practices, at least for me, I'm opinionated, which is silly in a certain way, but it's, it's just my opinion, but I feel like those kind of stuff, like I feel more excited about my student figure, like really saying, I want to fold in how I behave differently with one-on-one and with a group and really look at like what's going on with my mind. She was like, I really want to like really take a closer look at how I lose my values a bit when I'm with a group because I kind of want to be liked. And just, she's like, it's so weird. And she's like, it's just like add two people and I'm a different person. She's like, not totally. And I thought that that's much more interesting than having a big insight. Oh, I think I probably told this story too to you, Susan, like that, you know, I had like, you know, I was at this monastery about a month ago in Japan and had this ooh moment. Like, and I told my teacher about it. He's like, forget it. He's like, I don't want to hear about it. I love that kind of attitude because it ultimately is not that important. Who cares? Like, it's still how you behave. Like thinking about my grandmother, she's like, you know, the difference between well-meaning and what are you actually doing is much more interesting to me than like Kensho. Like, who cares? I don't.
Well, I care about you, Koshin, and this has been so wonderful to have you visit, and just so really enjoyed listening to you and reading your books, and we really wish the best in your endeavors. You're helping save the world one bodhisattva at a time, perhaps. So thank you very much for coming on tonight. With that, I wanted to thank everybody, Susan, for your introduction and your chat work, and then everyone else here at Pacific Zen, and yeah, there's just a lot of joy and a lot of love here, and that's a good test of practice, I think. You know.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John and Sangha. It's so awesome. What a delight. Ooh.
And that is
this is Bodhidharma burrito. You can.
Oh God, what a
He's
pretty
been on
cat.
my lap the whole time.
All right. Good night, Koshin. Thanks for staying up so late for us.
Good night, everybody.
All right.
Be well. Be well.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you.
Good night, all.